Catherine Hartwell stood in the drawing room of her late father's estate. Though it belonged to her uncle now, everything belonged to her uncle now, and felt the walls closing in with each word that emerged from Richard Hartwell's mouth in his practiced tone of false regret that barely concealed his satisfaction at having finally found a solution to the financial burden she represented. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and according to the rigid mathematics of her uncle's accounting, she had cost the family precisely £4,300 over the 3 years since her father's death from consumption had left her orphaned and dependent on Richard's dubious generosity. "The contract is already signed," Richard was saying, his fingers drumming against the mahogany desk with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he feared she might find some way to escape the trap he'd constructed around her future. "Lord Damien Ashford has agreed to settle all outstanding debts in exchange for your hand in marriage, and the wedding will take place in 3 weeks' time at his private chapel in Sussex. You should consider yourself fortunate, Catherine. At your age and with no dowry to speak of, you could hardly expect better prospects than a wealthy lord willing to overlook your advanced years and your family's financial embarrassment." Catherine felt something cold settling in her stomach, the kind of dread that came from recognizing that all the careful maneuvering she'd been attempting to preserve some fragment of autonomy had been rendered meaningless by decisions made without her knowledge or consent. "I would rather work as a governess," she said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will, "or as a companion to an elderly lady. I'm well educated, Uncle Richard. I could support myself respectably without requiring you to sell me to settle debts that have nothing to do with my own spending or choices." "Sell you?" Richard's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Don't be dramatic, girl. This is an advantageous marriage arrangement, nothing more. And as your legal guardian, I have every right to determine what's best for your future. Lord Ashford is wealthy, titled, and willing to take on the burden of a penniless spinster. You should be grateful rather than making ridiculous protests about governess positions that would pay you perhaps £50 a year and leave you entirely dependent on the whims of whatever family employed you." "What kind of man is he?" Catherine asked, because Richard's evasiveness about Lord Ashford's character had been growing increasingly pronounced over the past week, as the marriage negotiations had apparently been proceeding without her knowledge. "You've told me about his wealth and his title, but nothing about his temperament or his reputation. What aren't you telling me, Uncle?" Richard's expression shuttered completely, his eyes sliding away from hers in a way that confirmed her worst suspicions about exactly what kind of man would agree to purchase a bride through debt settlement rather than conducting normal courtship. "His character is irrelevant," he said flatly. "The contract is signed and legally binding. If you refuse to honor it, you'll be left with nothing. No home, no income, no family support. I've fulfilled my obligation to you for 3 years, Catherine, and I'm done subsidizing your existence when I have my own children's futures to secure. You'll marry Lord Ashford in 3 weeks, or you'll find yourself on the street with whatever possessions you can carry. Those are your options. Choose wisely." He left before she could formulate any response, and Catherine sank into the nearest chair, with her hands shaking and her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to dead end in variations of the same bleak outcome. She had no money of her own, no property, no relatives beyond Richard who might take her in, and apparently no legal recourse against a guardian who had decided to dispose of his inconvenient ward through marriage to a man whose character was so questionable that Richard couldn't even pretend to defend it when directly questioned. That night, alone in her room with a single candle burning and the house silent around her, Catherine wrote a desperate letter to the only person she could think of who might have both the resources and the inclination to help her, Lady Margaret Ashworth, who had been her closest friend during the years before Catherine's father's illness had consumed the family fortune and forced them to retreat from London society. Margaret had married well 3 years ago to a baronet with extensive property in Hertfordshire, and while their correspondence had been less frequent in recent months, Catherine still hoped that their childhood friendship might be strong enough to motivate Margaret to intervene somehow, to offer sanctuary or assistance. or at least advice about how Catherine might extricate herself from this nightmare. She sealed the letter with trembling fingers and gave it to the maid the following morning with instructions to post it immediately, and then she waited with the kind of desperate hope that felt increasingly futile as the days passed without response. What Catherine didn't know, couldn't know, was that Margaret's husband had intercepted the letter before Margaret ever saw it, that Sir Thomas Ashworth was the kind of controlling man who monitored his wife's correspondence and made unilateral decisions about what contacts and friendships she would be permitted to maintain, now that she belonged to him rather than to herself. But Margaret had her own methods of circumventing her husband's restrictions, cultivated through 3 years of marriage to a man who viewed her as property to be managed rather than as a person with agency and desires. She had a maid named Alice, who was loyal beyond the bounds of normal servant relationship, who understood that sometimes ladies needed to communicate without their husband's knowledge, and who could be trusted to carry messages that Sir Thomas would have forbidden if he'd known they existed. So when Alice reported that a letter from Miss Catherine Hartwell had been intercepted, and that the mistress had seemed distressed by Sir Thomas's reaction, Margaret made a decision that was both bold and potentially dangerous given her husband's likely response if he ever discovered what she'd done. She couldn't help Catherine directly. Her own finances were controlled entirely by Thomas, her movements monitored, her social interactions carefully curated to reflect well on him rather than to serve her own interests or friendship. But she knew someone who could help, someone with resources and influence, and a particular sensitivity to situations where women were being coerced into marriages against their will. She dictated a carefully worded letter to Alice, unsigned and deliberately vague about the sender's identity to protect herself from her husband's wrath if the letter was ever traced back to its origin. The letter described Catherine's situation in terms that were factual without being overly detailed, explained that Miss Hartwell was in danger of being forced into marriage with Lord Damien Ashford to settle her guardian's debts, and respectfully requested that the recipient consider investigating whether intervention might be warranted given the circumstance. The letter was addressed to Alexander Rothwell, Duke of Greystone, a man Margaret had met perhaps half a dozen times during her brief period in London society before her marriage, but whose reputation for honour and justice was well established among the aristocracy. More importantly, Margaret remembered hearing a story years ago about the Duke rescuing a young woman from a carriage accident, remembered the way people had spoken of his quick action and his genuine concern for the victim's welfare, and she hoped that same instinct for protection might extend to a situation that was less immediately dramatic, but no less dangerous in its implications for Catherine's future. Alexander Rothwell received the anonymous letter on a Tuesday morning while reviewing estate business in his study at Greystone Hall, and he read it 3 times with growing concern before summoning his secretary to make inquiries about Miss Catherine Hartwell and Lord Damien Ashford. The name Hartwell struck him with unexpected force, dredging up a memory he'd carried for 10 years with surprising clarity, given that the incident had lasted perhaps 10 minutes from beginning to resolution. A carriage accident on the road through his estate, a young woman of perhaps 16, thrown from the vehicle when the wheel had shattered and the horses had bolted, her father frantically trying to reach her, while Alexander and his groom had worked to free her from the wreckage before the damaged carriage could shift and crush her entirely. He remembered her remarkable composure once the immediate danger had passed, the way she'd thanked him with genuine gratitude rather than the simpering performance many young ladies affected when seeking to capture a duke's attention. He remembered her father, Lord Hartwell, he thought, though the title might have been different, explaining that they were travelling to London for the season, that his daughter Catherine was being introduced to society, and he remembered thinking that Miss Hartwell would do well in London, that her intelligence and self-possession would serve her better than mere beauty in navigating the complicated social hierarchies that could make or break a young woman's prospects. 10 years later, if this was indeed the same Catherine Hartwell, She was apparently facing circumstances that suggested her London season had not resulted in the advantageous marriage her father had hoped for, and that her current situation was desperate enough that someone felt compelled to write anonymous letters to dukes requesting intervention. Alexander's secretary returned within hours with preliminary information that confirmed the anonymous letter's basic facts. Catherine Hartwell was indeed the orphaned daughter of the late Lord Hartwell, currently living with her uncle Richard Hartwell, who served as her legal guardian, and recently betrothed to Lord Damien Ashford under circumstances that involved debt settlement rather than conventional courtship. But it was the information about Lord Ashford that made Alexander's jaw tighten with anger, and his determination to intervene crystallized into immediate action. Damien Ashford was notorious among those who paid attention to such things, a man whose wealth came from investments in industries that exploited the desperate, whose gambling debts were legendary, whose treatment of servants was cruel enough that he had difficulty keeping staff despite paying above market wages. There were rumors about his previous romantic entanglements, women who had ended relationships with him under circumstances that suggested coercion or worse, and whispers about financial arrangements with families who had daughters they needed to dispose of quickly and quietly. "Find out everything," Alexander told his secretary grimly. "Every debt, every scandal, every rumor about how he treats women. And find out exactly what leverage Richard Hartwell has over his niece that would make her agree to marry someone like Ashford. I want to know what we're dealing with before I decide how to proceed." The information that came back over the following 2 days painted an even darker picture than Alexander had initially suspected. Lord Ashford's wealth was indeed substantial, but it was built on foundations that any ethical person would find repugnant. Investments in mills that worked children until they dropped, properties where tenants lived in conditions barely better than animals, money-lending operations that trapped the desperate in cycles of debt they could never escape. His personal reputation was equally damning, with multiple former mistresses who had ended their associations with him, bearing bruises they claimed had come from accidents, but which everyone suspected had different origins entirely. And the debt situation was exactly as the anonymous letter had described. Richard Hartwell owed approximately £8,000 to various creditors. Debts that had apparently been accumulating since his brother's death had left him responsible for Catherine's maintenance, and Lord Ashford had offered to settle those debts in exchange for Catherine's hand in marriage, an arrangement that Richard had accepted with what appeared to be indecent haste, given that he'd negotiated and signed the contract within a week of Ashford making his initial offer. Alexander made his decision quickly once he had all the relevant facts. He would approach Lord Ashford directly and offer to buy out Richard Hartwell's debts, effectively removing Ashford's leverage over Catherine and freeing her from the forced marriage without requiring any direct confrontation with her uncle that might leave her even more vulnerable if the buyout attempt failed. It was a straightforward solution that should appeal to Ashford's mercenary nature. He would receive immediate return of his investment, plus a substantial premium for his trouble, and he would be spared the complications of an unwilling wife, who would undoubtedly make his life difficult if forced into marriage against her will. He found Lord Ashford at his club 2 days later, a man of perhaps 40, with the kind of dissipated handsomeness that came from years of excessive drinking and late nights, his eyes holding a calculating coldness that made Alexander's instinctive dislike crystallize into something harder and more definite. "Lord Ashford," he said, settling into the chair across from where Ashford sat, reviewing the racing forms with obvious interest. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about a business matter." Ashford looked up with the kind of false deference that men of his rank typically showed to dukes, while simultaneously resenting the hierarchy that required such performances. "Your Grace," he said, setting aside the racing forms. "Of course. What business matter brings the Duke of Greystone to my table?" "I understand you've recently entered into a marriage contract with Miss Catherine Hartwell," Alexander said directly. seeing no benefit in subtle approaches when the situation required clear communication. I'd like to offer you an alternative arrangement that I believe would be financially advantageous for you, while freeing Miss Hartwell from obligations she apparently entered into under duress. Something flickered in Ashford's expression, surprise perhaps, or possibly calculation about what this unexpected interest from a duke might mean for his position. I'm not certain what you mean by duress, Your Grace. Miss Hartwell's guardian negotiated the arrangement in good faith, and the contract is entirely legal and binding, but I'm certainly willing to hear what alternative you're proposing, assuming it's worth my time to consider. I'll purchase Richard Hartwell's debts from you at their full value plus 20%, Alexander said flatly. £8,000 becomes £9,600, payable immediately upon your agreement to dissolve the marriage contract and release Miss Hartwell from any obligation to proceed with the wedding. You'll receive a substantial profit for minimal effort, and you'll be free to pursue other marital prospects without the complications that would inevitably arise from forcing an unwilling woman into marriage. Ashford was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he laughed, a cold, humourless sound that made Alexander's hands clench under the table with the effort of maintaining his composure. No, Ashford said simply. I appreciate the offer, Your Grace, but I'm not interested in selling the marriage contract regardless of what premium you're offering. Miss Hartwell suits my purposes exactly as she is, and I have no intention of releasing her from our arrangement. What purposes? Alexander asked, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. Surely there are other women available if you simply need a wife, women who would enter into marriage willingly rather than under coercion. Why insist on Miss Hartwell specifically when she clearly doesn't want this match? Ashford's smile was particularly unpleasant, because 10 years ago, Miss Hartwell's father refused my suit when I requested permission to court his daughter during her first season, claimed I wasn't suitable for a girl of her quality and breeding, as if his failing finances and his country title somehow made his family superior to mine. I've waited a long time for the opportunity to demonstrate to Lord Hartwell, or to his memory, since the man is conveniently dead, that his judgment was fatally flawed. His daughter will marry me precisely because she has no choice, precisely because her family's circumstances have degraded to the point where refusing me is no longer an option. It's remarkably satisfying, Your Grace, watching pride be forced to bow to practical necessity. Alexander felt disgust churning in his stomach at this casual admission of using Catherine as an instrument of revenge against a dead man who had made the entirely reasonable decision to protect his daughter from a man whose character clearly didn't merit trust or respect. So you're willing to force an innocent woman into marriage simply to prove a point about social hierarchies and wounded pride? That's the purpose that makes you unwilling to accept a generous financial offer that would leave you substantially wealthier than the original arrangement. Precisely, Ashford agreed with obvious satisfaction. Money is useful, Your Grace, but revenge is priceless, and the particular pleasure of owning something that was once deemed too valuable for my possession, well, that's worth far more than £9,000 or any other premium you might offer. Miss Hartwell will be my wife in 3 weeks, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do to prevent it, short of invalidating a legally binding contract that her guardian had every right to negotiate on her behalf. Alexander left the club with his mind already working through alternative approaches, because Ashford's refusal had eliminated the simple solution and required something more complex and potentially more risky to achieve the same goal of freeing Catherine from this nightmare. If buying out the debts directly from Ashford wouldn't work, then perhaps purchasing the debts from the original creditors would. If he could locate them all and convince them to sell before the wedding date, then Richard Hartwell's obligations would transfer to Alexander rather than to Ashford, and the marriage contract would be void, because Ashford would no longer be settling any debts that provided his leverage over Catherine's future. It would be expensive and time-consuming, and would require his solicitors to work with efficiency that bordered on miraculous, given the limited time available before the wedding. But it was possible, and more importantly, It was legal and incontestable in ways that more direct interventions might not be. Alexander sent urgent messages to his legal team, instructing them to identify every creditor to whom Richard Hartwell owed money and to negotiate purchases of those debts immediately, regardless of premium required, with strict instructions that the transactions must be completed within 2 weeks to ensure they were in place before the scheduled wedding date. Meanwhile, Catherine was discovering exactly what kind of man she'd been sold to through a mandatory dinner at Lord Ashford's London residence, an evening that confirmed every fear her uncle's evasiveness had generated and which left her returning to her uncle's house with her hands shaking and her mind working frantically through escape scenarios that all seemed to require resources she didn't possess. Ashford had been coldly proprietary throughout the meal, discussing their future together in terms that made clear he viewed her as a possession he'd acquired, rather than a person with preferences or desires. And when she'd attempted to express opinions about household management or social arrangements, he'd dismissed them with casual cruelty that suggested such discussions were merely courtesies. He was extending temporarily, and which would cease entirely once they were married, and she was fully under his control. "You'll find I have very particular expectations for how my household operates," he'd said, as dessert was being served, his eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "My previous companions have sometimes found those expectations challenging to meet, but I'm confident that proper motivation will ensure your compliance. Your uncle assures me you're a sensible girl who understands the realities of your position, and I trust that understanding will translate into appropriate behaviour once we're wed." Catherine had smiled and nodded and made appropriately submissive responses while internally screaming, and when she'd returned to her uncle's house, she'd gone immediately to her room and begun systematically going through her possessions to determine what she could sell or pawn to generate enough money to escape London entirely, to perhaps make her way north where she might find work under a false name and build some kind of life that didn't involve being Lord Ashford's property. But her jewellery was mostly paste, her clothes were 3 years out of fashion and unlikely to fetch much at any pawnshop, and her books, her most valuable possessions in every way that mattered to her personally, would bring perhaps £20 total if she could find a buyer willing to purchase the entire collection. £20 wouldn't get her far, wouldn't provide enough cushion to survive while seeking employment, wouldn't be sufficient to establish herself independently in any city large enough to offer opportunities for educated women seeking respectable work. She was trapped as thoroughly as if her uncle had locked her in her room, trapped by poverty and by legal structures that gave guardians absolute authority over their wards' futures, and the wedding date was approaching with inexorable certainty. Then, 1 week before the scheduled ceremony, Richard summoned Catherine to his study with an expression that combined satisfaction and nervous energy in ways that immediately triggered her anxiety. "There's been a change in plans," announced without. "Lord Ashford has requested that we move the wedding date forward from next week to this Saturday, 3 days from now. He's concerned about some business matters that require his attention in the north, and he wants the wedding completed before he travels, so that you can accompany him as his wife, rather than remaining in London while arrangements are finalised." Catherine felt the walls closing in even further, the remaining days of her freedom shrinking from 7 to 3 with stunning abruptness. "That's barely enough time to make proper arrangements," she protested weakly, knowing, even as she spoke, that Richard wouldn't care about proper arrangements or traditional wedding preparations, that he simply wanted the marriage completed so he could stop worrying about his debts and his inconvenient ward. "The arrangements are already made," Richard said dismissively. "Lord Ashford's private chapel is prepared. The rector has agreed to perform the ceremony, and the wedding breakfast will be simple given the abbreviated timeline. You'll wear your mother's wedding dress. I've had it retrieved from storage and sent to be altered to fit you. This is actually fortunate timing. The sooner you're settled, the sooner we can all move forward with our lives without the burden of this extended engagement period." Catherine nodded mechanically because there was nothing else to do. No protest that would change Richard's determination to dispose of her as quickly as possible. and she returned to her room feeling like a prisoner being informed that her execution date had been moved up without explanation or justification. 3 days. She had 3 days to somehow escape or to resign herself to spending the rest of her life bound to a man whose cruelty was becoming increasingly apparent the more time she spent in his presence. She wrote another letter to Margaret that night, more desperate than the first, explaining the accelerated timeline and begging for any assistance or advice, or even just acknowledgement that someone cared about what was happening to her. But the letter never reached Margaret. Sir Thomas intercepted it, just as he'd intercepted the first one, and this time he confronted Margaret directly about her former friend's inappropriate attempts to involve his wife in family matters that were none of their concern. At Greystone Hall, Alexander received urgent word from his solicitors that they'd successfully located and purchased all but one of Richard Hartwell's outstanding debts, that final obligation being held by a creditor who was travelling abroad and couldn't be reached before the wedding date. But the news about the accelerated timeline had also reached Alexander through his network of informants, and he realised with sudden clarity that legal manoeuvring alone wouldn't be sufficient to prevent the marriage. Even if he managed to purchase that final debt, there wouldn't be time to properly document the transfer and present the evidence to Richard Hartwell and Lord Ashford before the ceremony. He would need to intervene directly, dramatically, in a way that would make clear to everyone present that the marriage was invalid, regardless of what contracts Richard had signed or what promises had been made. It was risky and theatrical, and would cause scandal that would reverberate through society for months. But Alexander found he didn't particularly care about scandal when weighed against the alternative of allowing Catherine to be bound for life to a man who viewed her as an instrument of revenge, rather than as a human being deserving of basic dignity and respect. "I'm going to stop the wedding," he told his younger brother Thomas that evening, as they reviewed the legal documents that proved Alexander now held virtually all of Richard Hartwell's debts. "I'm going to ride to Ashford's chapel and interrupt the ceremony before vows are exchanged, and I'm going to present evidence that the marriage contract is invalid because the debts it was meant to settle are no longer held by Lord Ashford, but by me. It will be dramatic and socially complicated, but it will be effective." Thomas regarded his brother with concern that was tinged with admiration. "You're risking your reputation for a woman you met once 10 years ago, a woman who might not even remember you, or who might have her own reasons for accepting this marriage that have nothing to do with coercion. Are you certain this is wise, Alex? Surely it's worth the potential consequences. I'm certain she's being forced into marriage with a man who openly admits he's using her as an instrument of revenge against her dead father." Alexander replied flatly. "I'm certain that Lord Ashford is the kind of man who abuses women and exploits the desperate, and I'm certain that allowing this marriage to proceed when I have the means to prevent it would be a failure of honour and basic human decency. So yes, Thomas, I'm certain. And I'd appreciate your support even if you think my approach is unconventional or potentially problematic from a social perspective." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I'll support you, and I'll make sure Greystone is prepared to receive Miss Hartwell once you've dramatically rescued her from her forced wedding. She'll need sanctuary while this mess gets sorted out legally, and she'll need protection from her uncle and from Ashford while you establish that the marriage contract is void. What happens after that? Whether she stays or goes, whether she chooses independence or accepts your protection long term, that's her decision to make once she's free from immediate danger." The morning of the wedding arrived grey and cold, with mist hanging low over the countryside and making the world feel smaller and more oppressive than usual. Catherine was dressed in her mother's wedding gown, the ivory silk altered to fit her slighter frame, but still carrying the weight of family history and happier circumstances than the nightmare she was currently living. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, saw someone who appeared calm and resigned, but whose eyes held a kind of desperate misery that no amount of careful cosmetics could entirely disguise. The carriage ride to Lord Ashford's private chapel felt interminable despite being less than an hour, Catherine sitting in silence while her uncle made small talk about the weather and the wedding breakfast and completely inconsequential matters that had nothing to do with the fact that he was delivering his niece to a man whose cruelty was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore or rationalize. The chapel itself was small and ancient, built centuries ago by some Ashford ancestor and maintained more out of family pride than active religious devotion, and it was cold inside, despite the candles that had been lit in apparent attempt to create appropriate ambience for the ceremony. Lord Ashford was waiting at the altar with the rector beside him, and when Catherine entered on her uncle's arm, she saw satisfaction in Ashford's expression that made her stomach turn with revulsion and fear. This was really happening. In a matter of minutes, she would be legally bound to this man, would become his property in all the ways that mattered under English law, would have no recourse if he proved as cruel in private as his reputation suggested he would be. The ceremony began with traditional words about marriage and commitment and partnership, phrases that felt like mockery given the circumstances that had brought Catherine to this altar and the reality of what her life would become once the vows were complete. She responded mechanically to the required prompts, her voice barely above a whisper, as she promised to honour and obey a man she neither honoured nor had any intention of obeying, beyond whatever minimum compliance was necessary to survive his control. The rector had just opened his mouth to ask if anyone present knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage, when the chapel doors exploded inward with such force that they crashed against the stone walls with echoes that reverberated through the small space. Catherine spun around along with everyone else present to see a massive black horse bursting through the entrance with a rider in dark clothing hunched low over its neck. The entire dramatic entrance so unexpected and so thoroughly unprecedented that for a moment everyone simply stood frozen in shock. The rider pulled the horse to a stop just inside the chapel, dismounting with fluid grace despite the confined space and the obvious agitation of the animal. He strode toward the altar with papers clutched in one hand and an expression of cold fury that made even Lord Ashford step back slightly from his position beside Catherine. And Catherine recognized him, not immediately, not in the first chaotic seconds, but as he drew closer and she could see his face clearly in the candlelight. She knew him, the Duke, the man who had pulled her from a shattered carriage 10 years ago, who had stayed with her until her father arrived, who had told her in that deep, steady voice that she was safe now, that everything would be fine. "This wedding is invalid," the Duke announced, his voice carrying clearly, despite the acoustics that tended to muffle normal speech in the ancient chapel. "The marriage contract is built on fraud, and I have documentation that proves Lord Ashford has no legal standing to enforce any agreement involving Miss Hartwell's future." He threw the papers at Ashford's feet with clear contempt, the legal documents scattering across the stone floor. "I am Alexander Rothwell, Duke of Greystone, and as of 2 days ago, I hold all of Richard Hartwell's legitimate debts. Debts that Lord Ashford claimed to be settling through this marriage arrangement. The contract is void because Ashford no longer has any leverage over Miss Hartwell or her guardian. Any attempt to proceed with this ceremony would be legally meaningless and socially catastrophic for everyone involved." "This is outrageous," Richard Hartwell sputtered, his face flushing with anger, and what might have been fear about his debts now being held by a duke rather than by the more manageable Lord Ashford. "You have no right to interfere with a legal marriage contract that was negotiated in good faith." "In good faith?" Alexander interrupted, his tone scathing. "You sold your niece to settle gambling debts, Hartwell. You negotiated with a man whose reputation for cruelty is well established, whose treatment of women is notorious among anyone who pays attention to such things. There was no good faith in any aspect of this arrangement, only exploitation and coercion." Lord Ashford had recovered from his initial shock enough to bend and retrieve the legal document, scanning them quickly with an expression that progressed from disbelief to fury. as he apparently recognized that everything the Duke was claiming was supported by legitimate legal evidence. "This doesn't change anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The contract is signed. The ceremony has begun. The contract is invalid," Alexander repeated with finality. "And if you attempt to proceed with this farce of a wedding, I will bring every resource I possess to bear on destroying you socially, financially, and legally. I will expose every questionable business dealing, every creditor you've cheated, every woman you've mistreated, and I will ensure that your name becomes synonymous with the kind of predatory cruelty that decent society should reject absolutely. Your choice, Ashford. Accept that this particular revenge fantasy is finished, or face consequences that will make whatever wounded pride drove you to this arrangement seem trivial by comparison." Ashford looked at Catherine with an expression that combined frustrated anger with something that might have been genuine hatred, and for a moment she thought he might actually try to physically claim her, to drag her to the altar, and demand the rector complete the ceremony despite the Duke's dramatic intervention. But then Alexander moved to stand between them. His body language became clear he was prepared to physically prevent any such attempt, and Ashford apparently decided that fighting a duke in his own chapel wasn't worth whatever satisfaction forcing the marriage might provide. "This isn't finished," Ashford said, directing the threat at Alexander rather than at Catherine. "You may have interfered today, Your Grace, but I have resources and connections of my own. Don't assume you've won simply because you've made a dramatic entrance and waved some legal document." "I'm not assuming anything," Alexander replied coldly. "I'm simply ensuring that Miss Hartwell has the freedom to make her own choices about her future, rather than being forced into marriage with someone who views her as a possession to be acquired, controlled. What happens next is her decision to make, not yours and not her uncle's, and certainly not mine to dictate. But I promise you, Ashford, if you make any attempt to continue pursuing this arrangement or to retaliate against Miss Hartwell for my intervention, you will discover exactly how unpleasant I can make life for someone who has earned my focused attention." He turned to Catherine, his expression softening slightly, though his posture remained tense with readiness to respond if Ashford or Richard attempted anything threatening. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his use of her name, rather than elaborate titles or formal addresses, struck her as unexpectedly intimate given the dramatic circumstances. "I know this is all very sudden and probably quite overwhelming, but I need you to trust me for just a few minutes longer. Will you come with me? I can offer you sanctuary at Greystone Hall while we sort out the legal complications and determine what options exist for your future that don't involve being anyone's pawn or property." Catherine looked at the Duke, at Alexander, though using his given name even in her thoughts felt presumptuous despite the fact that he'd just destroyed her wedding and offered her escape from the nightmare her life had become. She looked at her uncle, whose face was twisted with fury and calculation, as he apparently tried to determine whether fighting the Duke's intervention would be worth the risk given the social and financial consequences that might follow. She looked at Lord Ashford, whose expression promised exactly the kind of cruelty she'd been dreading since learning about the marriage arrangement, and she made her choice. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the chaos churning inside her. "Yes, Your Grace, I'll come with you." Alexander's relief was visible for just a moment before his expression returned to careful neutrality. He held out his hand to her, and Catherine took it, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip as he guided her toward where his horse stood waiting near the chapel end. Behind them, Richard Hartwell was shouting something about legal consequences and proper procedures, but Alexander ignored him entirely, his focus on getting Catherine safely mounted before anyone could physically interfere with their departure. "Hold on tightly," he said as he swung up behind her, his arm coming around her waist to secure her against him. "The ride will be rough for the first bit until we're clear of pursuit, but I promise you're safe. I've got you, Catherine. I've got you, and I'm not letting go." The horse lunged forward at his command, bursting back through the chapel doors and into the grey morning with Catherine clinging to Alexander's coat and feeling the peculiar combination of terror and exhilaration that came from having her entire life upended in the space of perhaps 5 minutes. Behind them, she heard more shouting, heard her uncle's voice and Ashford's raised in fury, but the sounds faded quickly as the horse carried them away from the chapel and toward whatever uncertain future waited at Greystone Hall. They rode hard for perhaps 20 minutes, Alexander guiding the horse through woods and across fields with the kind of sure knowledge that came from someone intimately familiar with the landscape, and Catherine simply held on and tried to process what had just happened, tried to understand why a duke she'd met once a decade ago would risk scandal and social complications to prevent her marriage to a man whose character was apparently well known enough that Alexander had been able to investigate and condemn it with confidence. Finally, Alexander slowed the horse to a walk and then stopped entirely in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, their branches forming a canopy that provided shelter from the light rain that had begun falling. He dismounted first and then lifted Catherine down with careful hands that steadied her when her legs proved unequal to supporting her weight after the frantic ride. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands remaining at her waist while he searched her face for signs of injury or distress beyond the obvious emotional turmoil that had to be visible in her expression. I'm not hurt," Catherine managed, though her voice was shaking and her hands were trembling where they gripped his coat for balance. "Just overwhelmed. Your Grace, I don't understand what just happened or why you intervened, or how you even knew about the wedding. Who sent you? How did you know?" "Someone who cares about you sent an anonymous letter asking me to investigate your situation," Alexander replied, releasing her waist, but keeping one hand gently supporting her elbow. "I don't know who wrote it, but the information they provided was accurate and concerning enough that I felt compelled to look into matters further. And once I discovered what kind of man Lord Ashford is and the circumstances under which your uncle had arranged this marriage, I couldn't allow it to proceed, not when I had the resources to prevent it and the legal grounds to invalidate the contract." Catherine stared at him, searching his face for some explanation that made sense of why a duke would go to such extraordinary lengths for someone he barely knew. "But why?" she asked. "You don't know me, Your Grace. We met once 10 years ago for perhaps 10 minutes, and while I've never forgotten your kindness during that carriage accident, surely that brief encounter doesn't explain this level of intervention or risk on your part. What made you decide my situation warranted such dramatic action?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Do you remember what I said to you after we got you clear of the wreckage? After your father arrived and we determined you weren't seriously injured?" "You told me I was safe," Catherine replied, the memory crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "You said, 'You're safe now,' and you stayed until you were certain my father had everything under control, and I wasn't going into shock from the trauma." "I've never forgotten that encounter," Alexander said quietly. "Never forget your remarkable composure, or your gratitude, or the way your father looked at you with such obvious love and pride. When I learned that you'd been orphaned and that your guardian was forcing you into marriage with someone like Ashford, I couldn't reconcile that information with the memory of a young woman who deserved so much better than being treated as a commodity to be sold for debt settlement. So I intervened. Perhaps it was presumptuous of me. Perhaps I should have simply purchased the debts and let the legal process handle matters without the dramatic chapel entrance. But I wanted to be certain you understood you had choices, that you weren't trapped by circumstances beyond your control." Catherine felt tears gathering despite her best efforts at maintaining composure. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering, for caring enough to investigate, for being willing to risk your reputation to prevent that wedding. I was terrified, Your Grace, terrified of what my life would become if I was forced to marry Lord Ashford, and I had no idea how to escape or who might help me. You saved me. Again. Twice," Alexander said with a slight smile that transformed his severe features into something warmer and more approachable. "Though I'd prefer we not make a habit of these dramatic rescues. Once we reach Greystone, we need to discuss what happens next, what you want your future to look like, what resources you need to build the kind of life you choose, rather than accepting what others choose for you. But Catherine, I want to be clear about something important. You're not trading one obligation for another. You're not now indebted to me or required to accept my protection if you prefer independence. I'll provide you with whatever support you need to establish yourself however you wish. And if that means never seeing me again after the immediate crisis is resolved, I'll respect that choice even though— He stopped, seeming to reconsider whatever he'd about to say. Even though what? Catherine prompted gently. Even though I hope you'll choose otherwise. But we'll discuss all of that once we're at Greystone, and you've had time to recover from what must have been an extraordinarily traumatic morning. For now, let's just focus on getting you somewhere safe and warm, where you can begin processing everything that's happened. Greystone Hall materialized through the rain like something from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and mullioned windows and ancient architecture that spoke to centuries of wealth and careful stewardship. Catherine felt her breath catch at the sight of it, at the recognition that this grand estate was now her temporary sanctuary, that she was about to enter the home of a duke who had risked social scandal to prevent her forced marriage, and whose motivations remained mysterious despite his explanation about remembering their previous encounter. Alexander's brother Thomas was waiting at the entrance, his expression combining relief at their safe arrival with barely concealed curiosity about the woman his brother had so dramatically rescued. "Miss Hartwell," he said with a bow that was formal but not cold. "Welcome to Greystone. I've had rooms prepared for you in the East Wing, and Mrs. Cooper, our housekeeper, will see to anything you need while you're staying with us. I hope you'll consider this your home for as long as necessary to sort out the legal complications and determine your next steps." "Thank you, my lord," Catherine managed, still feeling overwhelmed by the rapid succession of dramatic events. "You're very kind to open your home to someone in my circumstances." "Your circumstances are not of your own making," Thomas replied firmly. "And my brother was right to intervene when he discovered what was being done to you. No one deserves to be forced into marriage with someone like Ashford, regardless of what debts or obligations their guardians have accumulated." Mrs. Cooper appeared and guided Catherine to the rooms that had been prepared, a suite of chambers that were more luxurious than anything she'd experienced since her father's illness had consumed their family fortune. The housekeeper was kind and efficient, helping Catherine out of the ruined wedding dress and into a simple day dress that had been hastily procured, arranging for hot water and tea, making it clear through gesture and tone that Catherine was a guest to be cared for rather than an inconvenience to be tolerated. Alone finally in the sitting room of her suite, Catherine sank into a chair by the fire and let herself process the morning's events with something approaching rational thought rather than pure emotional reaction. She was free. Lord Ashford no longer had any claim on her. The marriage contract was void, and she was under the protection of a duke whose resources and social position made him essentially untouchable by her uncle or by anyone else who might seek to force her back into the arrangement she'd escaped. But freedom came with its own complications. The scandal would be immediate and devastating. A bride disappearing from her own wedding after a duke dramatically interrupted the ceremony would be gossip that spread through London society within hours, embellished and distorted, until the truth became barely recognizable beneath layers of speculation and judgment. Catherine's reputation would be destroyed, her chances of ever making a respectable match essentially eliminated by the taint of scandal, and the assumption that something inappropriate must have been happening between her and the Duke for him to take such dramatic action. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Alexander entered at her invitation, looking less formal now with his coat removed and his hair slightly dishevelled from the ride. "How are you managing?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I know this has all been overwhelming, and I'm sorry for the chaos and the social complications my intervention will have created. I've been thinking about how to handle the scandal, how to protect your reputation as much as possible given that what happened this morning will be discussed throughout London by tomorrow." "There's no protecting my reputation," Catherine said with resignation. Everyone will assume either that we've been having an illicit affair that motivated your dramatic rescue, or that you've developed some inappropriate attachment that will make me appear to be pursuing a duke through manipulative means. Either way, I'm ruined socially. No respectable man will consider me after this, and I'll be forever defined as the woman whose wedding was interrupted in the most scandalous manner imaginable. Achim. Alexander was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his response carefully. There is one option that would protect your reputation and provide you with unassailable security, he said finally, though I'm reluctant to propose it because I don't want you to feel pressured into accepting something you don't want simply because it solves practical problems. What option? Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew what he was going to suggest. Marry me, Alexander said simply. Not because you're obligated or because you need to trade one forced marriage for another, but as a practical arrangement that serves both our interests. A marriage of convenience that would give you social position and financial security while also explaining my intervention in a way that society can accept. We could structure it however you prefer. Separate residences if you want independence. A marriage of name only if you don't want physical intimacy. Complete control over your own finances and property through legal documents that protect your autonomy. I would ask nothing of you except that you allow me to provide protection and support while you figure out what kind of life you want to build. Catherine stared at him, trying to process this unexpected proposal. You would marry me to protect my reputation. Bind yourself for life to someone you barely know simply to prevent a social scandal. I would marry you because I think we could build something worthwhile together, Alexander corrected gently. Not romantic love necessarily, at least not immediately, but genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. I've been managing Greystone alone since my father died 5 years ago, and while I don't need a wife for social reasons or to provide heirs with any particular urgency, I find myself drawn to the idea of having someone to share the responsibilities and the decisions with, someone intelligent and capable who wouldn't simply defer to my judgment, but would actually contribute to managing the estates and the various charitable endeavours and all the other aspects of ducal life that become tedious when there's no one to discuss them with. That's the most unromantic marriage proposal I've ever heard, Catherine said, but she was smiling slightly despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I know, Alexander agreed with an answering smile, but I'm trying to be honest about what I can offer and what I'm asking for, rather than pretending romantic feelings that don't exist yet. Though, Catherine, I want to be clear. If you accept this proposal, I wouldn't require the marriage to remain purely practical forever. If affection develops naturally between us, if we find ourselves wanting something beyond polite partnership, I would welcome that development. But I won't pressure you, or expect it, or make you feel obligated to provide emotional intimacy you're not ready to give. The choice would be yours, always. Catherine thought about her limited options. She could accept Alexander's proposal and gain security and social position while maintaining significant autonomy through whatever legal protections he was offering. Or she could attempt to build an independent life with the resources he'd provide and accept that her social reputation would be permanently damaged by the scandal of the interrupted wedding. Neither option was perfect, but one offered the possibility of genuine partnership with someone who had demonstrated remarkable honor and consideration for her well-being, while the other offered lonely independence and permanent social ostracism. I accept, she said quietly, not because I have no other choice, though my options are certainly limited, but because I believe you when you say you'll respect my autonomy and protect my ability to make my own decisions, and because I think you're right that we could build something worthwhile together, even if it starts as a practical arrangement rather than a romantic attachment. When would we marry? As soon as possible, Alexander replied. I can arrange a special license within days, and we can have a private ceremony here at Greystone with Thomas serving as witness. The sooner we're legally married, the sooner we can begin controlling the narrative about what happened this morning and why I intervened so dramatically in your previous wedding, Society will gossip regardless, but married to me, you'll have the protection of my position and my resources. And people will eventually accept the story we construct about a long-standing attachment that only recently developed into marriage plan. They were married 3 days later in Greystone's small chapel, a simple ceremony that bore no resemblance to the elaborate production Catherine's uncle had been planning for her marriage to Lord Ashford. She wore a dress borrowed from Thomas's wife, who was conveniently similar in size, and she spoke her vows with clear certainty, despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought her to this altar. Alexander's responses were equally steady, his hand warm and solid when he slipped the ring onto her finger, his kiss brief and chaste when the ceremony concluded, and Thomas congratulated them on their marriage. "Welcome to the family," Thomas said warmly, as they moved from the chapel to a small wedding breakfast the household had prepared. "I'm glad my brother had the courage to act on his instincts and prevent that disaster of a marriage your uncle was forcing you into. And I'm glad you were brave enough to accept his rather unorthodox proposal, despite all the complications and uncertainties it must have involved." "Thank you," Catherine replied, meaning it. "Your brother saved me twice, and I'm learning that Alexander Rothwell is apparently the kind of man who makes a habit of rescuing people whether or not it's convenient or socially appropriate to do so." The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm as Catherine began learning what it meant to be Duchess of Greystone and discovering that Alexander had meant what he said about respecting her autonomy and valuing her contribution. He included her in decisions about estate management, genuinely listened when she offered opinions about tenant relations or household operations, and made it clear through both word and action that he viewed their marriage as a partnership rather than as a hierarchical arrangement where his authority superseded her judgment. They maintained separate bedchambers as he'd promised, Alexander never pressuring Catherine for physical intimacy beyond the minimal public displays of affection required to convince society that their marriage was legitimate rather than purely a legal fiction designed to prevent scandal. But the emotional intimacy between them grew steadily as they spent evenings discussing books they'd read and political developments and the various challenges of managing a property as extensive as Greystone, with all its complications and competing obligations. Catherine found herself managing the household charities with genuine enthusiasm, discovering that she had both aptitude and interest in organizing programs that provided education and healthcare to the estate's tenant families and to the surrounding communities. Alexander supported these efforts without trying to control them, providing funding and occasionally offering suggestions, but generally trusting Catherine's judgment about what approaches would be most effective and most welcome among the people they were trying to help. And somewhere during those weeks of learning to live together and work together and build something that resembled genuine partnership, Catherine realized she was falling in love with her husband of convenience, that the respect and affection and intellectual compatibility had transformed into something deeper and more emotionally complex than she'd anticipated when accepting his unromantic proposal. She wasn't certain when Alexander's feelings shifted beyond friendly partnership into romantic attachment, but she noticed the way his gaze lingered on her during dinners, the way his touch became more frequent and less perfunctory, the way he seemed to seek out opportunities to spend time with her, even when estate business didn't require their joint attention. And one evening, perhaps 2 months after their wedding, when they were working together in the library, reviewing accounts and planning the next quarter's charitable initiatives, Catherine looked up from the ledger she was examining to find Alexander watching her with an expression that held unmistakable warmth and desire. "What?" she asked, setting aside the ledger. "I was just thinking that I'm remarkably fortunate," Alexander replied, not looking away or trying to disguise what he was feeling. "I entered into this marriage as a practical arrangement designed to protect your reputation and provide you with security. And somehow I've ended up with a wife I genuinely love, someone who makes every aspect of my life better through her presence and her partnership. That wasn't what I expected when I proposed, Catherine, but it's what I've discovered, and I wanted you to know." Catherine felt tears gathering at this simple declaration. "I love you too," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to. didn't think it was possible to develop genuine romantic feelings in a marriage that started as pure pragmatism. But somewhere between the estate management discussions and the charity work and the evenings spent reading together by the fire, I fell in love with you, with your honour and your kindness, and your remarkable willingness to listen to opinions that differ from your own, rather than simply assuming your judgment is always superior. Alexander crossed the distance between them and pulled Catherine into his arms with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "May I kiss you properly?" he asked. "Not the chaste public kisses we've been exchanging, but something that actually reflects how I feel about you." "Yes," Catherine breathed, and his mouth found hers with a passion that had been building throughout the weeks of careful restraint and polite distance. The kiss deepened until Catherine was clinging to him, and everything else, the library, the ledgers, the world beyond their embrace, faded into insignificance beside the recognition that their practical arrangement had transformed into something genuine and profound and absolutely worth the scandal and social complications that had brought them together. But scandal remained a complication that required addressing, particularly when Lord Ashford began spreading rumours throughout London society about the circumstances of the interrupted wedding and Alexander's supposedly inappropriate relationship with Catherine that had motivated his dramatic intervention. The whispers and speculation were damaging Greystone's reputation in ways that extended beyond personal gossip to affect business relationships and political alliances, and Alexander finally decided that direct confrontation was necessary to put an end to Ashford's campaign of retaliation. "I'm going to Parliament," he told Catherine one morning over breakfast. "I'm going to request a formal inquiry into Lord Ashford's business practices and his treatment of women, and I'm going to present all the evidence my investigators have gathered about his exploitation and his cruelty. It will be public and it will be messy, but it's the only way to definitively end his ability to damage your reputation or to continue harming other vulnerable women who might fall into his clutches." "I want to be there," Catherine said immediately. "I want to stand beside you when you present the evidence, to show society that we're united and that our marriage is legitimate and based on genuine partnership rather than scandal or impropriety." "Will you let me do that, Alexander? Let me be your partner in this confrontation, rather than staying safely at Greystone while you handle everything." Alexander studied her face, clearly weighing his instinctive desire to protect her against his recognition that she had every right to participate in defending their reputation and confronting the man who had tried to force her into marriage. "It won't be pleasant," he warned. "Ashford will try to paint you as complicit in some elaborate scheme, will suggest things about your character and your motivations that are untrue and unfair, but which will be difficult to refute without providing the kind of personal details that might be embarrassing to discuss publicly." "I don't care about embarrassment," Catherine replied firmly. "I care about truth and justice, and ensuring that Lord Ashford can't continue exploiting women the way he tried to exploit me. Let me stand with you, Alexander. Let me be your team in this fight, rather than someone you're fighting to protect, while I wait passively for you to handle everything." So they went to Parliament together, Catherine dressed in elegant simplicity that projected dignity rather than attempting to compete with the elaborate fashions that London society typically favoured, and they stood united as Alexander presented evidence that systematically dismantled Lord Ashford's reputation and revealed the extent of his various exploitations and cruelties. There were documents from former employees describing working conditions that bordered on slavery, testimony from women who had ended relationships with Ashford, bearing injuries they attributed to his violence, financial records proving he'd cheated business partners and exploited desperate families through predatory lending practices. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented, impossible to dismiss as rumour or exaggeration, and by the time Alexander finished his presentation, the chamber was silent with the kind of shocked recognition that came from having comfortable assumptions about a fellow aristocrat's character completely shattered by facts that couldn't be rationalised away. Lord Ashford attempted to defend himself, to claim that the evidence was fabricated by a duke seeking revenge for some imagined slight. but his protest rang hollow in the face of documentary proof and multiple witnesses willing to testify under oath about his cruelty. The inquiry concluded with formal censure and the recommendation that Lord Ashford's business licenses be revoked pending further investigation into potentially criminal activities. And while he avoided actual imprisonment through connections and legal maneuvering, his social reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Within weeks, he had retreated to his country estate to avoid the scandal, and the whispers about Catherine and Alexander's marriage transformed from speculation about impropriety into admiration for a duke who had taken extraordinary action to protect a vulnerable woman from a predator hiding behind aristocratic title and respectability. Catherine and Alexander emerged from the confrontation with their partnership strengthened rather than damaged by the public scrutiny, society gradually accepting that their marriage was legitimate and based on genuine affection rather than scandal or calculation. And 6 months after the interrupted wedding that had set everything in motion, they stood together on Greystone's terrace, watching the sun set over the estate they managed jointly, their hands linked and their future stretching ahead, with possibilities that neither had anticipated when Alexander had burst into that chapel on his black horse to prevent a marriage that would have destroyed Catherine's life. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked quietly. "Regret the scandal and the social complications and the dramatic gesture that brought us together in such an unconventional way?" "Never," Alexander replied without hesitation, pulling her closer against his side. "I regret that you had to experience the fear and the coercion that your uncle and Ashford subjected you to. Regret that circumstances forced you into that horrible position. But I don't regret intervening. Don't regret proposing marriage to protect your reputation. And I certainly don't regret that our practical arrangement developed into genuine love and partnership. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Kath. You make me better, more thoughtful, more considerate, more willing to question my assumptions and listen to perspectives that challenge my comfortable certainties. That's worth any amount of scandal or social complication." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the colours deepen across the sky and thinking about the journey that had brought them from that desperate morning in Ashford's chapel to this moment of peace and security and genuine happiness. "I used to think being rescued meant being saved by someone stronger who would take care of everything while I remained passive and grateful," she said. "But you taught me that real rescue means being given the resources and the support to save yourself, to make your own choices about what kind of life you want to build. You didn't just save me from Lord Ashford, Alexander. You saved me from accepting that my life would always be determined by other people's decisions and other people's needs. You gave me agency and partnership, and the recognition that I'm capable of contributing meaningfully to something larger than my individual survival. That's the real gift you gave me, more valuable than security or social position or even love, though I'm profoundly grateful for all of those things as well." "We saved each other," Alexander corrected gently. "You saved me from a life of lonely competence without genuine partnership, from the assumption that duty and responsibility had to be shouldered alone rather than shared with someone who actually cares about the outcomes and the people affected by our decisions. We're a team, Catherine. We built something together from the chaos of that interrupted wedding, something stronger and more meaningful than either of us could have created independently. And I'm looking forward to spending the rest of our lives continuing to build and grow and face whatever challenges come with the confidence that we'll handle them together." They stood together as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Two people who had been brought together by scandal and desperation, but who had chosen to transform those difficult circumstances into genuine partnership and deep love. Catherine had been sold by her uncle to settle debts, had been rescued by a duke who remembered saving her life a decade earlier, had married that duke in a practical arrangement designed to prevent social disaster, and had somehow found in that unconventional marriage everything she'd stopped believing was possible: love, partnership, purpose, and the freedom to be fully herself rather than performing some role assigned by other people's expectations. And Alexander, who had interrupted a wedding on a black horse in a gesture so dramatic it would be gossiped about for years, had found in his rescued bride not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who challenged him and supported him and made every aspect of his life richer through her presence and her willingness to engage fully in building their shared future. They had been twice rescued, once from a carriage accident, once from a forced marriage, and they had rescued each other from loneliness and from the assumption that practical arrangements couldn't transform into profound love. The scandal had faded, the gossip had been replaced by admiration, and Catherine and Alexander stood together on their terrace in the gathering darkness, bound not by obligation or convenience but by choice, and by the deep recognition that they had found in each other something rare and precious, absolutely worth fighting for.